And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we're at the University of Texas in Austin interviewing professors who are also authors. And now joining us is Ami Petitzour. He is the author of this book, The Israeli Secret Services and the Struggle Against Terrorism. Professor Petitzour, first off, what are the Israeli Secret Services?
Well, the Israeli Secret Services is a very elusive body of various organizations, including the branches of the military, the Shin Bet, which is the Internal Security Service, the equivalent to the FBI in the United States, the Mossad, which is the equivalent to the CIA, and within the army we have the intelligence branch, which is doing pretty much whatever the NSA is doing here in the US.
What is their working philosophy when it comes to counterterrorism?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because it's a working philosophy of trial and error. And terrorism, unlike other types of warfare, is very surprising, and it's not the kind of threat that militaries are used to deal with. And what happened in Israel over the years is that terrorism took an increasing role in the public domain and became not a strategic threat to the Israeli society, but a very annoying phenomenon that policymakers had to respond to quite often. The problem with terrorism, unlike other military threats, is there is a lot of emotional burden on policymakers to make immediate decisions and to soothe the public and to reassure the public that they are in control of things. However, terrorism, as a phenomenon, is something that it's very hard to control and contain, and therefore it's much more challenging than fighting a Syrian division or an Egyptian, armor brigade.
But Israel's rather unique in the sense that it's dealt with terrorism for years and years and all kinds of terrorism. Have they perfected a model that you've seen?
Whenever they do perfect a model, the terrorists are innovating. So, for example, if we think about the last several years, the Second Intifada, when Israel was coping with a very formidable challenge of suicide bombers, eventually, between 2002 and 2004, they came to the conclusion that erecting a barrier between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and reoccupying parts of the West Bank would be a good solution. And it did work, because since 2004, the number of suicide terrorist attacks is insignificant. However, it didn't eliminate terrorism, because then Hamas, for example, learned that in order to keep pushing their agenda, they can use rockets. So once you erect a barrier, they'll come up with a new mode of operation, which would lead to new challenges.
Well, in your book, you talk about 4 different models of counterterrorism. What are those 4 different models?
Mostly what we're talking about is the gist of the argument is that most democracies tend to respond using the war model, which is treating terrorism as a kind of a warfare. And this is part of the, if we think about 9/11, this was the immediate response of the United States, trying to put terrorism in this kind of framework that is something that we know how to deal with. And of course, we tend to go to the military for advice. But the problem is that terrorism is not a military threat. It's a different animal. And that's why I'm introducing the criminal justice model. I'm introducing defensive models that are, in my opinion, more suitable to treating terrorism rather than using military force in an attempt to overcome the terrorist threat.
So you do not necessarily, Professor, see terrorism as an act of war?
I think that terrorism is again, it's not that I'm trying to, I think that we have to demystify terrorism. And what the problem is that once we declare a war on terror, we are doing something quite bizarre. We are not declaring a war on air bombardments, right? We are declaring a war on a country or an entity. So you cannot perceive terror as a military threat because first, in most cases, the objectives of the actors who are perpetrating terrorist attacks are different. They do not pose a strategic threat to the country. What they do is, frighten the public. Policymakers tend to, they look for those, formulas that they are aware of or they know for dealing with this phenomenon. And therefore, what we see is the immediate forceful response. Now, I'm not saying that terrorists should be spared. I'm just saying that sometimes if you really want to reduce the impact of terrorism, you have to look at it from a different perspective rather than a military one.
So here in the United States after 9/11, then President George W. Bush talked a lot about the war on terror. Incorrect in your view?
Yes, I think that when the United States launched the war in Afghanistan, it was the right thing to do. But, this was something that, ended within 6 weeks. Then what? You pretty much destroyed Al-Qaeda within the first 6 weeks and the Taliban regime. And then the war on terror ended. There was now we are in the 11th year of the war in Afghanistan. It's not a war on terror. It's a completely different kind of war, and it evolved over the years. So what I'm saying is that the United States took many, important measures over the years in an attempt to cope with terrorism, increasing security, using, all kinds of measures that are enhancing the capabilities of the intelligence community. But I'm not sure that the forceful reaction was the most important one in eliminating the threat. And by the way, today we see a different model, that using drones, targeting specific individuals in the Al-Qaeda network, rather than thinking about them as this kind of entity that you have to deploy the whole U.S. armed forces into a war against.
Now, Ami Pedizor, in Israel, is the war model the one that's usually used, or
yes,
are all four of the different models that you identify?
Mostly, policymakers around the world tend to resort to the war model because if you think about a politician in a democratic setting, they are being held accountable by their constituents. And when I wrote the book, I started doing the research right after the end of the Second Intifada. And I remember I came to the US in 2004 at the very last stage of the Intifada. From Israel. And during that time, for 4 years, we were terrified. And a terrified public is looking for an answer. And when you see a policymaker who is taking a tough position and is deploying special operation units, and I'm elaborating in a book about all kinds of assassination attempts, etc., it reassures the public that something is being done. However, for example, if we go back to the very famous example of the Munich Olympic Games in 1972, and the assassination campaign that the Israeli government launched against the PLO, we see that at the end of the day, it was a very unsuccessful attempt to, I'm not sure if the objective was really to undermine the power of the PLO or just to tell the Israeli public, listen, we are not going to sit still while our people are being attacked. So they were just targeting individuals that many of them had nothing to do with the plot against the athletes in Munich. So what I'm trying to say is that policymakers tend to look for modes of operation that are going to make their constituents, the public, feel reassured, rather than thinking about how to actually contain the threat of terrorism. And one of the problems is that the public looks for solutions, and there is no solution to the problem of terrorism. You can reduce the intensity of the attacks, you can make it a little less central at a given point in time, but humanity had terrorism for centuries. We've never we've never eliminated it. But the public still expects policymakers to do it, and this pressure leads them to resort to forceful measures that are, at the end of the day, not very effective.
Ami Pedizor is a professor here at the University of Texas, Austin. He's a professor of government and Middle Eastern studies. He's also the head of the Tiger Lab here at the University of Texas. What is the Tiger Lab?
The Tiger Lab is a small research center where we are conducting research on